The palace was not entered by force. That fact decided everything. Once a name was written into the register, there was no return. Girls arrived in daylight, escorted by ceremony and law. Doors opened quietly. Guards did not hurry them. No one shouted. Silk screens softened the light, and the air smelled of water and clean stone. It felt ordered. It felt safe. That was the first deception. They were told they had been chosen. Chosen meant protected. Chosen meant elevated. What it truly meant was owned. From the moment their sandals crossed the threshold, their bodies belonged to the court. Their futures narrowed without sound. Names were replaced with titles. Ages stopped mattering. Family ties thinned into memory. Each woman was taught how to stand, how to lower her eyes, how to wait. Waiting became the first discipline. One girl carried a thin silk thread tied at her wrist, a mark of placement she did not yet understand. It was light. It did not hurt. It never left her. The gates closed, and permission replaced choice forever inside them. The first decision was made by ink. Once the clerk pressed the reed to paper, the matter was closed. There was no appeal. Names entered the ledger in careful rows. Age, origin, physical note. Nothing else. Memory was not required. From that moment, return was impossible. A woman recorded there was no longer a visitor. She was inventory. The process felt calm, almost gentle. Movement followed schedule. Meals arrived on time. Instructions were clear. Obedience was rewarded with warmth, fabric, silence. Punishment did not announce itself yet. It did not need to. Isolation began quietly. Doors closed without sound. Conversations shortened. Women were moved between rooms without explanation. They learned not to ask. Asking was noticed. Being noticed carried risk. Each was given a designation that replaced her former name. It was easier to remember, easier to remove later. Family connections faded into stories no one else shared. A thin silk thread was tied at the wrist. It marked position, rank, proximity. It was light enough to forget, heavy enough to matter. The thread never loosened. It stayed while faces around it changed. Training followed. How to walk, how to wait, how to stand still when spoken to, how to remain still when not. Stillness became safety. No chains were visible. No raised voices echoed, yet movement narrowed daily. Routes shortened. Permission replaced choice. Compliance became the only skill that mattered. The ledger remained open. New names entered. Others were crossed through without note. The silk thread stayed exactly where it was. The first punishment was removal. She did not return. Morning revealed one bed empty. No explanation followed. No voice asked where she had gone. Asking was how attention was drawn, and attention decided who disappeared next. The corridor sounded the same. Water ran. Doors opened. The absence was treated as routine. Meals were served on time. Work resumed. The palace did not pause for loss. Silence hardened into rule. Names were shortened, then avoided. A woman could remain present only by not being noticed. Survival meant becoming small enough to pass without trace. The silk thread was still visible on the wrists of others. It marked place and nearness. It also marked risk. Everyone understood that threads could be removed without warning. The woman who had worn the missing one was not named again. Her place remained empty until it was filled. At first, the system appeared reactive. Disobedience seemed to come before punishment. Then the pattern shifted. Isolation came first. Days without speech. Weeks without movement beyond assigned rooms. The mind strained against quiet. Restlessness grew. That restlessness became proof. A glance lingered too long. A breath sounded uneven. Desperation was recorded as defiance. Survival itself became suspicious. No prayer broke the quiet. Faith was practiced inward, if at all. Shared belief could be mistaken for alliance. Alliance invited scrutiny. Women learned to hold their thoughts like breath, released only when alone. Even grief was scheduled, contained to private moments that left no trace. The palace rewarded this discipline with continued invisibility. To remain unseen was to remain alive, and even that condition was temporary, subject to review, subject to removal, subject to silence. No warning preceded the final decision. It was never explained. The thread was cut during a routine inspection. No words were spoken. No record explained it. The wrist beneath it was left bare. The woman stood still. The palace continued. It did not require explanation. Rebellion did not begin with weapons. It began with refusal. The door closed and it did not reopen. A command was delayed. Eyes did not lower quickly enough. That was sufficient. Disobedience had no fixed shape. It was defined after the fact, adjusted to need. Punishment followed without hearing or defense. The woman was taken to a room with no name. Confinement required no explanation. Time inside it stretched without measure. Meals arrived. Light changed. Nothing else did. Outside, life continued at its normal pace. Those who remained learned by watching absence. Each day without return clarified the rule. Silence was safer than compliance, because compliance could still be judged inadequate. Obedience failed not through action, but through interpretation. Faith was tested here without altar or prayer. Women whispered nothing, not even to themselves. Sound carried. Sound was remembered. The safest devotion was silence. Authority did not demand belief. It demanded order. Order was enforced through uncertainty. No one knew which rule would matter tomorrow. That uncertainty pressed inward, shaping behavior long before any door closed. It taught restraint before punishment, fear before consequence, and submission before command. This lesson settled quietly and remained, long after obedience failed once. Midway through, a harder truth settled. The punishment was not meant to correct her. It was meant to instruct the others. The locked door spoke louder than any order. Waiting became the lesson. Hours turned into days. Days became proof. The system did not need guilt. It needed visibility of consequence. Watching replaced participation. Fear replaced resistance. The silk thread appeared again on the wrists of those who stood nearby. It tightened, not physically, but in meaning. Proximity to power meant proximity to risk. Advancement narrowed tolerance. No rescue followed. None was expected. The women adjusted their breathing to the rhythm of the place. Time was marked by footsteps that never stopped. The door remained closed. Those waiting outside learned patience without hope. They measured days by silence rather than clocks. Each unanswered absence narrowed their world further. The palace rewarded this adaptation. Fear became internal. Control no longer required presence. The women carried the system within themselves, even while standing still. By then, punishment had already succeeded. Nothing else was required from the room. Its lesson traveled outward and settled everywhere inside. When obedience failed once, it failed forever. The palace did not forgive errors, it archived them. Somewhere behind the walls, a woman remained inside the room. Her presence mattered less than the silence she created. The lesson endured. Entry into these rooms ended a life as it had been known. Survival no longer mattered. Some spaces inside the palace were never given names. They did not appear on plans. Doors led to them quietly, without ceremony, and once crossed, a woman was removed from record. Her designation was closed. Her ledger line stopped. The transfer happened without anger. A guard arrived. Instructions were brief. Belongings were not requested. She was escorted through corridors used for storage and service, places meant to be passed through, not remembered. Light thinned. Sound softened. Inside, time changed character. Days were not counted. Meals arrived at fixed hours, always enough, never more. Conversation was unnecessary. Silence became part of the architecture. No one asked questions because there was no one to answer. The silk thread returned here, altered in purpose. It was no longer a mark of position. It was tied to restrain movement, to limit reach, to measure compliance. It did not cut skin. It did not need to. Its meaning was sufficient. At first, the room seemed temporary. A pause. A lesson. That belief kept endurance alive. Women waited for review, for reassignment, for something that would end the waiting. That expectation became the punishment. The trapdoor opened quietly. Endurance was not a path out. Endurance was the goal. Living longer extended exposure. Each day survived, confirmed the system was working. Pain was not required. Persistence was. Routine replaced fear. Fear required imagination. Routine required obedience. Tasks were assigned not for necessity, but for rhythm. Cleaning the same surface, folding the same cloth, standing still for long intervals without instruction. The body learned compliance faster than the mind. Records reflected this efficiency. Status shifted from present to contained. No explanation followed. Containment did not need justification. It was a category. Occasionally, movement occurred. Another room. The restraint. The thread adjusted. Always present. Always light. Always final. There were no witnesses inside. The purpose was removal from sight. Outside, absence spoke clearly enough. The palace did not hide these rooms. It simply never named them. Violence was unnecessary here. Order completed the work. Scheduling replaced cruelty. Repetition replaced rage. What happened inside did not require emotion from those who designed it. Some women marked time by breathing patterns, others by footsteps beyond the wall. Memory thinned without reference points. Faith, if it remained, became mechanical. A movement of lips without sound, repeated because repetition was allowed. Even sleep was supervised by light and sound. Rest never deepened. Waking felt identical to waiting. The body continued because stopping required permission that was never granted. That was the design, quiet, complete, and unrecorded. No appeal existed beyond the walls. Or memory remained. Some women lived. That did not mean they were free. Release did not restore a former life. It reassigned it. A woman was moved from one register to another, from visible to permitted. She carried a different name and a narrower future. Survival meant continuation under altered terms. Those who left the inner rooms did not return to open space. They were placed elsewhere within the system, in service, in isolation, in distant residences, where supervision remained constant. Movement required approval. Speech was measured. Past experiences were not discussed. They were not denied either. They were ignored. The palace kept survivors as evidence. Their presence proved restraint. It proved order. It suggested that obedience functioned. Punishment, it implied, could be avoided. Silence was therefore a choice. This was the deeper cruelty. The system needed living examples to justify itself. A dead woman could raise questions. A living one closed them. Midway through, the meaning shifted. Survival was not escape. It was incorporation. The woman became part of the explanation told to others. She stood as proof that compliance worked, even as her own freedom remained absent. Some were sent to provincial households, far from the court, where their past could not circulate. Others remained close, visible but unreachable. In both cases, surveillance followed. Letters were screened. Visits were managed. Marriage, if permitted, transferred oversight rather than ended it. A survivor learned to perform gratitude for breath, for food, for continued existence. This performance reassured observers. It calmed those still waiting. It suggested fairness. Inside, nothing healed. Silence continued its work. The body adapted. The mind narrowed. Choice became theoretical, something remembered rather than practiced. Faith shifted shape again, no longer a hope for justice, but a method of endurance. Years later, clerks updated lists without hesitation. A mark beside a name. A change in status. No explanation required. The silk thread remained described in careful handwriting, unchanged as time passed. Eventually, some survivors vanished from active records. They were not noted as dead. They were listed as completed. The word carried no emotion. It did not require one. Memory became the final loss. Without testimony, survival erased its own meaning. The palace did not need to destroy these women. It preserved them just enough to make forgetting efficient. Mercy in this system was simply another form of control. It extended life without restoring choice. It rewarded silence without granting dignity. The women lived. The palace endured. That difference mattered. It was proof used quietly, repeated often, and accepted without question by those who benefited from order. No one asked what survival had cost. The silence answered for them, completely. The record was complete. The people were not. Once a name entered the court books, it could disappear without explanation. Ink allowed that. Suffering did not need a column. Pain required no signature. What mattered was order, and order was easy to preserve when voices were excluded. Court historians wrote carefully. Dates were precise. Titles were consistent. Transfers were marked, yet entire lives collapsed into narrow phrases. Removed, reassigned, completed. These words carried no weight on the page. They were treated as routine outcomes of administration. A woman could vanish between lines. One entry closed, another opened elsewhere. The distance between them held everything that was never written. Silence was not an oversight. It was policy. At first, the record seemed incomplete by accident. Gaps appeared where explanation should have lived. Then the pattern emerged, absence repeated with discipline. When several volumes were read together, the omissions aligned too perfectly to ignore. Suffering had been edited out deliberately. Midway through, the meaning shifted. These documents were not failing to tell the truth. They were performing it. By removing detail, they protected authority. By avoiding narrative, they avoided responsibility. The system did not forget these women. It categorized them until memory no longer applied. Clerks followed rules handed down through generations. Faith shaped those rules. Obedience sanctified them. A belief formed quietly that order itself was righteous regardless of cost. Recording harm would have implied doubt. Doubt was not permitted. The silk thread appeared once more, now only as description, a note beside a name. Status indicator unchanged across years. The body it once circled was never mentioned again. The thread outlived the person. That was acceptable within the system. Some entries showed hesitation. A margin mark. A scratched correction. Even here, restraint dominated. The writer stopped short of detail. Silence prevailed again. It always did. The palace relied on this cooperation. Bureaucracy and belief reinforced each other. Clerks did not need to witness cruelty to sustain it. They only needed to record outcomes. Authority handled the rest. Over time, the records grew cleaner. Language narrowed. Complexity disappeared. This was not refinement. It was erasure perfected. When future readers searched these books, they found stability. They found continuity. They did not find women. That absence was the final confirmation. Disappearance was intentional. Memory had been regulated until it no longer resisted. The system endured because it documented itself, not its victims. And the books remained quiet. They always would. Stone does not forget in the way paper does. It waits. Behind restored walls and polished corridors, older spaces remain sealed. Passages bricked without explanation. Doors that lead nowhere. Rooms absorbed into newer structures, not destroyed, only hidden. The palace carries these layers without comment. Entry into these spaces is no longer permitted. They are described as unused, unstable, unnecessary. That language repeats an older habit. What cannot be explained is closed. What is closed eventually disappears from conversation. Archaeological traces resist this silence. A worn threshold, a groove in stone where fabric passed repeatedly, a fastening point placed with intention. These marks do not accuse, they simply remain. Midway through, understanding shifts. The palace was not cleansed of cruelty, it was reorganized around it. New functions grew over old ones. Administration replaced confinement. Offices replaced rooms without names. The structure stayed intact. The silk thread appears again, preserved not as cloth, but as reference. An inventory note. A storage listing. Material retained long after purpose ended. It lingers where people did not. No single artifact explains what occurred. Together, they create pressure, the absence of decoration, the uniformity of repair, the careful sealing of certain corridors while others were renovated openly. Choices were made about what should be seen. Visitors walk these halls now without awareness. Footsteps pass above spaces never reopened. Work continues. Conversations echo faintly. The building performs normal life convincingly. Nothing here resolves. The cruelty has no ending because it was not designed to conclude. It functioned, then withdrew from sight. That withdrawal became its final stage. The palace still holds what it was taught to keep: silence, structure, memory without testimony. The weight of that absence settles slowly. It does not demand reaction. It invites recognition. What remains is not proof in the dramatic sense. It is persistence. Stone holding shape, walls holding secrets, a system leaving behind just enough to be felt, never enough to be confronted fully. The palace endures. The rooms remain unnamed, and the question waits quietly, pressed into stone, unanswered and intact. No names are spoken aloud anymore. That silence is permanent. The women are gone from registers, from corridors, from memory shared between voices. Erasure was completed quietly. What remains is structure. Walls still stand. Procedures still make sense to those who follow them. The system did not collapse when the women vanished. It adjusted, recorded, and moved forward. This is where the story ends, not with revelation, but with absence. There is nothing left to recover except fragments. A thread described an inventory, a sealed door, a line crossed through and never explained. Remembering does not restore what was taken. It does something smaller and heavier. It refuses the comfort of forgetting. It notices what order tried to smooth away. You are not asked to rescue anyone here. That moment passed centuries ago. You are not asked to judge either. Judgment would be easy. Witness is harder. To witness means to accept that silence was designed, that obedience was rewarded, that suffering did not need spectacle to function. It only needed routine. The palace remains convincing. It always was. What failed were the voices inside it, removed until none remains to contradict the record. If you have listened this far, you now hold what the system could not erase completely. Memory requires a carrier. So the question remains, calm and unavoidable. There is no answer offered here, only wait. Who carries responsibility for remembering when silence was the final punishment?